Maybe they take it a little too far. Dennis, on parliamentary reform, though, the essential difference, I guess, that people will immediately notice will be a restriction on the answers to questions.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, yeah, the question time will be the most noticeable change, and I think it's a change for the better. I mean, things got way out of hand under Kevin Rudd. I mean, his 12-minute answers were ridiculous and sort of boring for Australia, I think was one term. So yeah, that will be the most noticeable. A lot of people watch Question Time, listen to Question Time. Hopefully they'll get a bit more out of it. I mean, we'll have to see how it eventuates. I mean, a 4-minute boring answer can be just as bad as a 12-minute boring answer.
Can seem like longer. Actually, when Labor, when Julia Gillard was the manager of opposition business, she put in a submission on parliamentary reform that called for 4-minute time limits. And back then the complaint was that Kevin Andrews, who was the longest answerer, sometimes went up to, 3 minutes 50. Outrageous.
Yes,
of course, by that stage we were all ignorant as to the 12-minute horrors that lay in store. Yeah. Incidentally, I think there may be an exemption for Rob Oakeshott on the 45-second question. He will be extended up to 17 minutes, I believe. I
was wondering whether there might be one for Bob Katter, because Bob Katter does ask the longest questions in the history of the universe. I mean,
he can go from bananas to Brazil in the space of one question.
Now, the question to Julia Gillard on who will run foreign policy in this country, were you left in any doubt, Gerard, about who that will be?
Not really. It'll be run by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. I don't think Kevin Rudd's going to be given flexibility to do what he wants. I think it'll be run by the Cabinet, but he'll have some say, obviously. I don't think there's going to be a huge presence for Kevin Rudd over the next 3 years. He'll be a senior minister, senior cabinet minister.
Well, the Prime Minister left us in no doubt just then, did she? I mean, what did she say at the end of her response to your question? At the end of the day, I'm the Prime Minister.
Now, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, but Rob Oakeshott in particular is coming under a fair bit of pressure for the decisions that they took. And particularly in Rob Oakeshott's, they opened up on him really over this issue, one of them anyway, that he'd at some stage suggested when he was in the New South Wales Parliament that he talked to the Labor government there about a ministerial position. Have a look at this.
He's a Labor Party person in National Party clothing. And I don't think that's really honest.
The vibes coming from Rob Oakeshott were pro-Labor, and frankly I don't think Tony Windsor's ever gotten over his falling out with the National Party.
Look, I don't have any recollection of any conversation, and in fact, I think the currency of the faceless men is on show today with that story.
Well, he says he doesn't remember that particular conversation.
What a load of rubbish. Come on. Fair go. You don't remember the conversation where you asked someone to become a minister. You don't remember the conversation you had with the Premier of New South Wales about becoming a minister. There are a lot of things I forget in life, but I don't reckon I'd forget that one.
Now, they don't seem to be operating on this theory that you never know when you might need these guys, because the numbers are very tight, but...
The funny thing about the dispute about Rob Oakeshott and this sort of revelation, which is a decent story about him approaching Morris Yemma looking for a portfolio a few years back, seems to sort of miss the significance of this guy. I mean, he's not a judge. I mean, he's not a member of the judiciary. The overtone of the reporting was that this blows to smithereens any pretense Rob Oakeshott had to complete even-handedness. But I mean, the guy used to be a member of another political party. He was an MP for the National Party, but no one is kind of suggesting that his role is to be someone who is this kind of judicial figure.
It follows that if he had have put his hand up for Tony Abbott and the coalition, then Ron Boswell and all the rest of them would have said what a great decision and what a patriot he was. It's convenient.
You say if. That was never on. Oakeshott and Windsor were always going to go with Julia
I accept that.
Tony Windsor said early on...
Why do you say that?
Well, I'll give you an example. Well, Tony Windsor said very early in the piece that to go in with the National... that being a member of the National Party was akin to having cancer, which was hugely offensive for cancer sufferers the world over. A terrible thing to say, but it gave you an idea of his mindset. Oakeshott Rod Oakeshott is not only garrulous, self-indulgent and unprofessional. We now know he's got a bad memory. He can't even remember discussions whether he had or didn't have discussions with the New South Wales Premier. He was always going to go with the Labor Party because, as Ron Boswell said, I mean, essentially he's a Labor man. Just listen to what he says.
But he is what he is. I mean,
well, he is what he is.
These people are in these situations because of the vagaries of the Australian electoral system and the way people voted. Like, that's why they're there. Not because they've been nominated by some sort of independent arbiter as being
point is this.
The people who have the obligation to make a choice between two sides in a completely independent environment free of other considerations.
Rod Oakeshott and Tony Windsor were always going to go with Julia Gillard. That's their choice, fair enough. They kept the country for 17 days in suspense, and then Rod Oakeshott gave a speech which was... Rob Oakeshott gave a speech was self-indulgent. As the Prime Minister and the alternate Prime Minister were waiting outside watching, he went on for 17 minutes without saying what he was doing.
Joe, what would you be sitting here saying today if... on the Sunday after the election, both of them had bobbed up and said, look, I hate the National Party, I may as well just say it now, I'm going to back in a Labor government. I mean, you'd be sitting there saying, you know, how outrageous, but if they'd announced the decision right then, you would criticise them for not having taken...
But I guess the point is they were hanging out for the very best possible deal they could get.
But what they went on is what they said they were going to do already, which was broadband. What they ended up after day 17 was what they started with on day 1. So what was the reason? They could have got it much before that. I thought their behaviour was extremely unprofessional and rude. Well, you may like sitting at 17 minutes, but Tony Windsor did the right thing.
I'm happy to spend 17 minutes. I've sat through 17-minute, single answers from Kevin Rudd. I'm a veteran.
But they could have told the Prime Minister and the opposition leader first. That would have been courteous.
And it would have leaked. And there'd be no sense of drama.
Yeah. Well, drama for them, but I mean the electorate... There were people all over the country hanging on this ponderous, long-winded, garrulous person who was making dance movements on the floor, waiting to go back to work out who was the government. I mean, the whole financial system virtually shut down for 40 minutes while people waited to see what was going on.
What they did, of course, in the end was to give support for the government on the floor of the Parliament, but not support on any individual piece of legislation, and that's what's new. I'm not sure, though, whether the opposition has got its head around that. Here's Bob Baldwin on what it's like to be in opposition.
The role of opposition is not to govern the country. The role of opposition is to hold a government to account for the actions and the legislation that it puts forward to make sure it is in the national interest.
But what's new now is that both the opposition and the government start on an equal footing in terms of legislation. It's open to either of them to initiate legislation and to then argue for support.
It is. And this is kind of this is something that is kind of seeping through the consciousness of the opposition now, I think, because they're in a position where the assumption has always been, oh, well, the opposition can't initiate bills, but it's only because they can't initiate money bills in the Senate, and the fact that that's the only area where the opposition's ever had much influence in the Senate, we kind of assume that the opposition can't initiate bills. Well, they can, and the parliamentary reforms make it easier for private members' bills of any kind to be brought on and discussed. So this is an opportunity for the opposition, and it creates something of a
only
quite
to
intense...
a degree, though, because I think it's still a grey area as to whether they can introduce or should introduce legislation that impacts on the budget.
Well, they can. They can introduce policy legislation that has a cost attached, let's say the parental leave scheme. But the question then becomes one for the government. If that legislation gets through Parliament, through both houses, the question is whether it's then signed off by the Governor-General, whether the government can advise the Governor-General not to sign off on it. Because the way that governments do appropriations, i.e. paying for bits of legislation that cost something, is they lump them all together into the appropriations bills a couple of times a year. So the question then becomes whether the government is obliged to stump up for whatever legislation the two houses of Parliament have actually waved through. And that's kind of like quite a fascinating constitutional question.
And more broadly, there's a debate about both legitimacy and a mandate. I think the different arguments. We'll have a look first at what people are saying on the question of a mandate.
This is not a mandate for any government.
Look, I'm not sure I'm going to agree with Rob Oakeshott on that.
The Parliament